Chapter 9, Development, Key Issue 4. Why do countries face obstacles to development? We've talked about this a number of times, this core periphery concept, also kind of that north-south divide between developed and developing. Core periphery, just remember it's Wallerstein. It's part of this world systems theory he has, where there's certain countries that are the core countries. Those are the developed, and the developing are of course, the peripheral countries. This really starts with the period of colonization, industrial revolution. So in each case, the ones that were first were the core, and the other ones were left behind. So in the periphery, still that primary sector, that agriculture, and a kind of cool picture of a family on a motorcycle. And those are all in Bolivia, so a very poor country, a very developing country. So 1900, just reminding that, you know, it was the countries that first were able to industrialize that became the core. All right, so it also can be used, this terminology, in relation to political context. And so the countries that have the highest levels of economic prosperity and dominant economics are also those that have political power, often over the periphery countries. The peripheral nations are dependent as suppliers of raw materials, so they need to sell their raw materials to often get the things that they need to survive. So progress and development, yes, the gap has closed in some ways, and look at this really cool picture of people climbing out of poverty in Africa. And so increase in Human Development Index over time, based on this, just the Human Development Index level, so low, medium, high, and very high, all of it's gone up. Infant mortality has gone down in all groups, not very much in the, of course, the low. And then life expectancy change by Human Development Index level. And so we see that moving in the right direction. It's going up. Here we see, yeah, it's going up, but it's going up the most in the very high. So it's the developed countries that are making more money. So two paths to development. Self-sufficiency was kind of favored in the past, and international trade is really the golden child now. And so self-sufficiency is just where you try to make it on your own. You cut yourself off from imports and exports and try to have your own, all of your own industries. It can really be hard, and it really didn't. Actually, let's go to the next slide because we're talking about the problems. It really didn't solve much that it was supposed to solve, because it was inefficient, where you're trying to reinvent the wheel and trying to create car companies and medicine companies and all sorts of companies. And so the government had to get involved a lot of the times, and so that was made the government really big and sort of inefficient in itself. And then also you had these high prices because there was no competition, and so the companies in that country could charge whatever they wanted to, and the product didn't have to be technologically advanced because, again, there wasn't anywhere else that they could buy them. And so this really just led to a stagnation, and it did not prove to be successful. In countries, I think India is the example in your book, countries like India, where they just did not experience great success. So onto the international trade development model, and we've got Rostow's development stages as sort of the common idea of how countries develop using international trade. So just remember that as you go through each of these steps, you become more and more developed. So most developed countries are in stage 4 to 5, less developed are in 1, 2, or 3. So going through them individually, Rostow step 1 is traditional. There's no development that has happened. People are agricultural. People are very involved in their local communities, no technology. And then step 2, and this mirrors what Rostow says, mirrors what happened in Great Britain with industrialization. And my warning is, well, we have to consider that things are a lot different now as the whole, much of the world has industrialized. So the elite develops innovations. They are ready to invest in technologies and infrastructure such as roads. The productivity increase, and people have surplus for trading using that new technology. Not everybody has to be agriculturalist anymore, so there's extra stuff, extra surplus. And so we've got industrialization occurring then, and we've got, well, textiles. And, you know, if you look in the world today, so it was Great Britain, but also in some of the developing countries like in Latin America, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, they are making clothes and making textiles. So this is the next step. That's what they start to export as they have surplus textiles. Then you start to get mature, and so standard, eventually over a long period of time, standards of living rose, and starting to use better technologies, and workers are educated, and more wide range of goods, bringing us to this really today for the developed countries. So mass consumption, tons of different products, very highly advanced, economically very well off and prosperous compared to the other countries of the world, the peripheral countries of the world. So this is the model, and there are some examples that your book talks about, the 4 Asian dragons. I've always heard them referred to as the 4 Asian tigers, and so either one is fine. And so this is countries that were able to really rapidly industrialize, and they generally relied on, for the tigers, they relied on low cost wages, so very, very poor wages, just like in Great Britain and the United States when we industrialized, and following that kind of trade path of just pure, like, let's produce as much as we can and sell it to the rest of the world and develop in that way. One of the things with some of these countries like Singapore and Hong Kong is that they didn't have a lot of choices. They had to trade because they're so tiny, they don't have a lot of resources on their own. And then when we look down here, this is also kind of a different example in the sense that, if you've got petroleum, that when the prices went up, they were very poor and became very, very wealthy quickly. And so not everybody has that as a resource. All right, so triumphs. This is now the approach that countries use, or that they're encouraged to use by the international organization like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So optimism that, yay, everybody can follow in the steps of Japan, and that India is moving towards international trade, or as they move toward international trade, their growth went up much, much more than with the self-sufficiency model. And then also this thought that, well, the developing countries formerly were colonies, and so their resources were taken. Now their resources are their own to sell. And I put a question mark there, right? Because of course we still have a lot of the businesses, and even to some extent the governments, controlled by the wealthy elite, who are somewhat controlled by multinational corporations or the people that work for them. And so a lot of the developed countries still control some of the resources in those developing countries. So it's not as cut and dried as now suddenly those developing countries can get rich from their own resources. So that's a problem. Shortcomings of the international trade model, well, other than what I just mentioned about former colonies not necessarily having, or developed countries having, control of their resources. So this market decline, so if prices for the products that the developing countries sell decline, and they've put all of their everything into this basket of international trade, then they can really lose a lot. They can decline further. They can become even more impoverished since not everybody has oil. And then increased dependence on undeveloped countries, because they're going to need to import things as they're exporting and focusing their energies on that. Unrealistic, the idea that every country can make this progress and become that. A lot of people look at that and say that that's unrealistic, and especially when we're talking about that kind of high consumption, it's hard on the planet. So maybe the system needs, some people say it needs to have a core and a periphery to work, both within your country and internationally, globally. And then a lot of the countries seem to just get more and more in debt and have more problems with this system. And then also warfare and instability. This is one of the things that draws back other countries and multinationals from developing, is that And they do put more money into, developed countries put more money investment into developed countries than they do in developing countries. And part of the reason is some of that instability that comes along with the poverty that's there. So again, we've got another vicious cycle. The World Trade Organization is very controversial, and so this is something that was basically founded to supervise and open international trade. And I emphasize open because they enforce trade agreements, they enforce the lowering, and they try to push countries and companies to lower any barriers to trade at all. And because of that, they're not popular with a lot of people sometimes because, for example, farmers in one country then have to lower their prices. Think about bananas and how cheap they are already. Well, those farmers are going to be making even less when they have to lower their wages to compete with farmers in countries next door. They can't protect their produce at all. Governments don't like it because they take away that control. And so that kind of brings me to this. So there's always, you hear a lot of times when there's a World Trade Organization meeting, you hear about a lot of protests. And so liberals say it's not democratic, it's kind of closed door, and it gives a lot of power to large corporations and not to the poor, okay, the poor farmers and that to set prices and things. And then conservatives say that it takes power away from the government of a sovereign nation, and then it forces them to change their taxes and have unfair trading. So people on both sides are not happy with the World Trade Organization, but it's a fact of life. And so that's something, we'll talk more about it in class. So financing development, two sources. So direct investment, and as I was mentioning, a lot of times that goes more towards developed countries by transnationals than it does to developing countries. The loans tend to go more towards the developing countries, and this is the IMF and the World Bank, both of which were formed after World War II. The World Bank helps to develop your infrastructure, helps to develop your electricity, things like that. Even the World Bank itself admits that a lot of its projects have failed. It wants to develop infrastructure so that the people will invest more, or corporations will invest more. Lots of corruption into carrying out those programs, and it really hasn't really solved the problem. And then there's huge amounts of debt because of both of these. And then the International Monetary Fund provides loans to basically to help countries keep trading, to keep their currency stable and things like that. Both of them have led to a high amount of debt because these are loans, these are not gifts. And so as you can see, those peripheral countries often are getting into debt. When those countries cannot afford to pay back their incredible amounts of debt, then these organizations give some kind of austerity measures, as they call it, which is to adjust their loan. They have to make certain concessions, like they have to cut programs to the poor often, they have to sell some of the government things like electricity to private companies, and so that also upsets a lot of people. Now, we had a global crisis during your lifetime, 2008, partly based on this housing bubble, meaning the prices of homes, or people just kept buying homes, prices of homes went up and up and up, and so people thought they were going to make money. The financial institutions in the United States were not sound, and they were not making sound loans, so it really threatened to bring down our entire banking system, and our government had to do a lot of bailing out. It rippled throughout the entire economy of the entire world, and so that was something that we're still recovering from today. All right, so fair trade. Yay, onto again, at the end of the chapter. So we've got here the prices of, dun dun dun, coffee. And this is just to show that fair trade harvest brand, hey, it's Anchor Farms. You can get this at Target. You can get this pretty much anywhere nowadays. Yes, you're going to pay a little more for it, but what do you get for paying a little more for it? You get to feel super good about yourself because you are caring about the producers, communities, consumers, and the environment. And so fair trade, when you see that sticker, you know that the farmers have gotten a fair wage. And so instead of free trade, which tries to undercut the farmers or the workers, this has made sure that the farmers or whoever produces has gotten something that actually provides a living wage for them and it is usually much more sustainable, meaning caring for the environment. Go Fair Trade!